This interview is with Captain Thomas J. Hudner, Jr. in Concord, Massachusetts on March 28, 2001. My name is Michelle Kelly. I'm the Director of Oral History at the Battleship Massachusetts. I'd like to start by asking a few questions about your background. Could you state your full name and where and when you were born?
My name is Thomas J. Hudner, Jr. And what else?
And where were you born and when?
I was born in Fall River, Massachusetts.
And did you grow up in that town?
Yes. I was born in 1924. I grew up in Fall River, went to the public schools there, and my home was Massachusetts, at least until after I got into the Navy in 1943.
Do you have any recollections of the Depression?
I do remember the Depression, but the memories aren't nearly so strong as would be for other families, because my father was treasurer of, I guess at the time, Fall River's biggest grocery market, Hudner's Market, and so although I know the Depression affected us like a lot of other families, it didn't have the same impact on us as it did on a lot of the people in Fall River who were mill workers, factory workers, who were badly hurt by the Depression. But we did grow up in a Depression climate, yes.
Do you have brothers and sisters?
Yes, I have 3 brothers and a sister. I was the oldest. I have a brother younger than I, another brother about 3 years younger than I. My sister is about 5 years younger. And then another brother is 11 years younger, so a total of 5 of us in the family. And
what did you do for fun as a child?
Well, the usual things, and I say usual, what most kids did. I was almost all 3 seasons played in sports, football in the fall. In the winter, we used to skate quite a bit, at least when the weather was cold enough to make a lot of the water around us suitable for skating. And then during the spring, a lot of baseball. And during the winter, we used to spend the summers at Westport Harbor, which is about 15 miles from Fall River. Those are the days when, obviously before television, so we spent no time in front of that. And skied not a lot, but when we had the opportunity, which weren't too often, but at least once a year we'd have a chance to get up into New Hampshire to do some skiing. That's about it.
And how did you decide to go into the military?
Well, living in Fall River and close to Newport, we had a chance a couple times to go down and see the ships that would come in and go out on board and visit them, and that really caught my attention. Then as a kid I read some books about the old sailing days and about the Navy, and so when I was still fairly young I thought it'd be interesting to get into the Navy, if not to make it a career, at least to spend a part of it there. And then I began to think of the Naval Academy and went to prep school, Andover, with the idea of going to the academy from there. But frankly, I wasn't very strong academically, and I sort of gave up the idea of going to the Naval Academy until the war broke out. And knowing of the pretty good education I was getting at Andover, that if I could swing it at Andover, I ought to have a good shot at the Naval Academy. So I put in an application, and I applied at the same time through the same congressman as a fellow that I grew up with, Jack Brayton. Jack Brayton and I knew each other from the time we were hardly able to walk because our parents were very close. So Jack and I went all through school and got appointments from Congressman Joe Martin, who was the Speaker of the House for several years. And I felt there was no chance at all of getting in because Jack certainly would get in. He had all the tickets. He was academically qualified, and I was a little bit discouraged. But having what at that time was called an alternate appointment, I at least had the opportunity to take the examinations for the entrance to the academy. And then 3 or 4 days, or less than a week before graduation from school, I got a telegram from Joe Martin's office saying that one of his appointees had bilged out of the academy. So he had an opening and offered it to me. So Jack Brayton and I went down to the Naval Academy together after spending our whole lives together in the same schools. And we ended up in the same company, and not until graduation from there were we ever separated. And Jack was one of the few drivers to get the Massachusetts up here to Fall River. So he was president, I think, of the committee for a while, and he was very closely associated with the battleship from several years before they actually got the ship up here until the time he died.
So did you have any relatives who went into World War II? Or friends?
Well, my 2 older brothers were both in the service. My next oldest brother was in the Army Air Corps in Europe during the war. And my youngest brother, he went into the Army just after the war was over. And then that brother, Rick, was recalled into the Army after the Korean War started. Then my youngest brother, Phil, went into the Marine Corps for a couple of years after college in the early 50s. But he didn't see any service in Korea.
When did you graduate from the Naval Academy?
I graduated in 1946, and that was an accelerated class, of which they had about 4 or 5 during the war. We would normally have graduated in 1947, so we're designated class of 47, but we graduated in 46, which was just a little bit less than a year after the war was over in the Pacific.
So where was your first duty?
The first duty I had was on board a cruiser out in the China station, and I picked her up in Tsingtao, China, which is a couple 100 miles north of Shanghai. And I was aboard her for about 8 months. When she came back to the States, I had orders waiting for me to go back out to Pearl Harbor. And I was on a staff out there for about a year, involved in communications and handling a lot of classified message traffic. A very interesting time because of all the post-war activity that was going on, what was happening in China, and matter of fact, all through Europe. But since we were in the Pacific Fleet, the concentration of what we did was in the Pacific.
You said that when you were on the first ship you were on, was that the Helena?
Helena,
sorry.
Yeah.
You actually went on shore in China, did you? Or you actually went into China?
Went ashore?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Can you describe it?
Well, the first look I had at China was in Tsingtao, and we'd get to go ashore a couple times a week. I don't remember too much of the city itself. It was a fairly big and bustling city, but we got out into the farmland quite a bit, and we used to see farmers all over the place, and very definitely there was impact war had on was present every place. A lot. We didn't see a lot of bombed out buildings and things like that, but you could see that combination of the economic results of a war like that and the generally low economic state to begin with, we were dealing with, or used to see people pretty far down the economic scale. And Shanghai itself was one of the biggest, if not the biggest city in all of China, and that was a real bustling place. But what impressed us was the primitiveness of a lot of it. It was not at all unusual in the main streets in town to see some oxen pulled carts with these big, heavy loads. There'd be just two-wheeled carts and a bunch of what we'd call coolies trying to, keeping the oxen going and to keep the big loads they had on them from becoming unstable with the possibility of dumping in the load. Down in a creek which ran through Shanghai called Wangpu Creek was just full of sampans, and people spent their whole lives on the sampans. Sometimes kids never got off those little tiny boats to go ashore for several years after they were born, and people just lived their whole lives there. It'd probably be the father of the house would, of course, have to get off, and maybe the mother, but the mother spent most of the time with the kids. Would have to get off the boat to get the living essentials, food and things like that. But most of the time it was just almost an unbelievable life on those boats. It stank all the time because there's very little sanitation there. You'd see them scoop up water in pans and things like that filthy water, and that was used for cooking, probably for drinking and everything like that. And before we left China, the mainland, before we came home, we went down to Hong Kong, and Hong Kong was a completely different place. It was just like, I think of it as almost like a magical kingdom. It was clean, bustling. People had a lot of vitality, a lot of wealth there, and that was in 1946 or 47. So there are definitely two Chinas, and I know there are almost every country is made up of at least two different styles of living. One of them would be very opulent, with the wealthy living, some of them living much better than you or I could even imagine, and yet within miles of the way they live, people living in abject poverty. And it's still going on. I'd like to think that the people who lived in the poverty that we saw, just because of the way life is going on and progress is taking place, that those poor people are in a lot better position, even though still they're poor. But I'm sure that in China especially, a lot of those people live in near slave conditions, as it is all over the world.
How did the Chinese act towards the Americans? Well,
they were most of those we ran into, they were very hospitable to us, but there's an awful lot of communist influence in China. Now, the communists, even before World War II started, there's a lot of infighting between the communists and the nationalists, and for their own survival, they had to stop that fight to fight the common enemy, who were the Japanese. So we were received for the most part quite well, but the language barrier was very, very big, and you go and see shopkeepers. That's mostly what we did when we were ashore. We'd spend a lot of time in the shops of various places. for the most part, they're very good to us. They wanted our money, and most of them realized that we were part of their savior from the Japanese. But I enjoyed it very much. We young officers had an opportunity to meet some of the, not wealthy, but the upper-class Chinese who like to entertain the sailors. And we didn't get to go to big social events at all, but and I was never invited to any of the private homes, although some of the people were. But it was very obviously a country which had suffered quite a bit from the war. And that picked up again after we left when the communists came in and took over. It's probably as bad now, if not worse than it was then.
So after the Helena and after Pearl Harbor, you went to naval flight training in Florida?
No, I got orders when the Helena got back to the States. I had orders waiting for me to go back out to Pearl Harbor. And the reason I was ordered from the ship was that after the war was over, men were getting out of the Navy in droves, the officers and enlisted personnel. And the armed services were made up of a lot of reserves. And almost everybody in communications in the Navy during the war especially were reserve officers. And I was in communications on the Helena. So the people in the Bureau of Personnel were trying to find replacements who had communications background to take the places of all those reserves who had been communicators who were getting out. And by communications, we junior officers would review all of the message traffic that came in and decided who was supposed to get this. And we disseminated it through the ship. And one of the extra responsibilities we had was to encode and decode messages, classified messages that would be going out or coming into the ship. So I had orders to go out to St. Pat headquarters at Pearl Harbor. And what I did there was just practically the same thing I did on the ship, except on a much grander scale. We were sending messages out for 4-star admirals, and messages would come in, and we had access to a lot of this communications traffic, and it gave you a pretty good idea of what's going on in the world. You get some of the might say secret thoughts of these admirals out there, what they were passing on to their superiors in Washington or among themselves. And as interesting as it was, and as good a group as it was, I've been out of the Naval Academy only a little over a year, and I was very frustrated because I spent the time at the Naval Academy to be aboard ship, and everything that shipboard life goes along with it. And I was getting frustrated just really, although they called it sea duty for us because it was overseas, it was shore duty nevertheless. And I finally requested orders to flight training. And we had been expected to spend a minimum of 2 years before we could go to flight training after graduating. And so I sent my name in just to have my name on a list of people who would be called. And almost immediately I got orders to flight training because the Air Force, in 1947, they passed the National Security Act, which made the Air Force a separate service. And they used to be the Army Air Corps, part of the Army. And they wanted to take over all of aviation. And so the Navy wanted to protect its own interests. And those of us who put in for flight training, whose names were on the list to go to flight training, as soon as we could be freed up by our commanding officers, they sent us orders to flight training. That's what I did. Once I put my request in, then my name was on a list, and I had a fellow who wanted to come to my job. I wanted to go to sea, so when we tried to get swap orders, this fellow was detached from his ship, came immediately up to Pearl Harbor to take my place, but instead of my being ordered to the ship, I got ordered to Pensacola. So I got there to flight training. My guess is at least 8 months, if not a year and a half earlier than I would have otherwise. So I started flight training in the spring of 1948, a little less than 2 years after I graduated.
Did you have to undergo any kinds of tests, like psychological, physical, and eye tests?
Oh, physically, yeah, very, very thorough physical, and seeing, hearing, everything about you had to be good. Heart had to be good. You had to be in a fairly good physical condition. And then they had some rather basic psychological tests, and tests which were designed to see if you could adapt yourself to flying, because you're working in a three-dimensional environment there. And I forget what the name of the test was. It was probably something like aviation aptitude test. So it was a pretty thorough screening even before you got to Pensacola. And a lot of fellows washed out. Some of them early in the phase before they really got into flying. And then there are some fellows who went pretty well along in the program, and they just couldn't hack some of the later phases of the program and were sent back out in the fleet as deck officers.
And did you go to Texas after that?
Yes. At that time, I recall our basic training was in the Pensacola area, and then when we graduated from basic training to advanced training, which used to be called operational training, that was in Corpus Christi. So I went to Corpus Christi I spent about 8 months there. Roughly 10 months in the Pensacola area and 8 months in Corpus Christi.
What kind of planes did you train on?
Well, I flew only 2 types of aircraft going through flight training. They had just finished using as a primary flight trainer what they call a Stearman Yellow Peril. It was a yellow bi-winged airplane, which was used extensively during the war for flight training. But we started off into a small single two-place training aircraft called the SNJ. The Army Air Corps version was the T6, and we got during the early phase of our flying, we'd always have an instructor in the back seat. And when we finished up at basic training in Pensacola, flying the SNJ, sometimes called the Texan, we went to Corpus Christi, and then for advanced training flew the Corsairs F4Us. And out there we concentrated mostly on formation flying, simulated bombing and gunnery, got some navigation, and the finale of this was making 6 carrier landings on aircraft carrier. All naval aviators at one time have to have made 6 landings in a carrier before they could get their wings. So it was the Corsair the SNJ Texan, and then the F4U Corsair, which are the two airplanes I flew in flight training.
And you flew off of an aircraft carrier?
Well, my training at the time we finished basic training. I'm digressing a little bit. The way it was decided whether we go to multi-engine training or single-engine training was just by a draw of the straw. Depending upon how many openings there were in the advanced training command as to whether you're going to fly multi-engine airplanes, that's the big airplanes, or carrier-type planes. We drew straws, and the 5 or 6 of us, and 2 of us were going to go to single-engine training. The other 3 would go to flight training, and to multi-engine training. And I was lucky to have pulled one of the straws so I could go to single-engine or fighter attack training. And so after I got my wings, I got orders to a squadron at Quonset Point, which is right across Narragansett Bay. And the first squadron I went to was flying a relatively new aircraft called the AD Skyraider. But I was in there for only a month when the squadron was decommissioned, and I was sent over to a Corsair squadron, which was just phasing out of the F-8F Bearcats to the old Corsairs of World War II. And I was assigned to a Corsair squadron because that's the type of training I had in Texas. And so the transition for me into a squadron, into Corsairs, would be very easy because I'd already had a couple hundred hours of flying time in the Corsair. So that was the squadron I was in when, well, back off a little bit. Squadrons always were primarily based ashore at one of the naval air stations spread out all over the country. And when it came time for us to deploy to wherever we were going, and almost all the time was the Mediterranean for us for 6 months, then we operated off the carrier all the time. So our space in the hangars that we left back at the air station were usually taken in our absence by reserve squadrons using the hangar space and everything like that. So I spent about 2.5 years in that squadron, and about half the time we'd be aboard ship, the other time we'd be ashore.
And that was off what carrier?
The Leyte, L-E-Y-T-E.
And what squadron was it?
Fighter Squadron 32, or VF-32.
Did you usually fly the same plane or different ones?
No. You got whatever airplane was available and most convenient for where you were going to be when you're on the ship. They'd had the aircraft. Most of the time, most of the aircraft were parked back aft in the after portion of the ship, which is where all the airplanes would be prior to starting the takeoffs. And you might be assigned an airplane only because you're number 2 person in the flight and your plane is in the front row, so you'd be assigned to that. A lot of people feel that pilots had their own airplanes. Well, a lot of squadrons had the practice of putting the pilots' names on the fuselage just under the cockpit. But that was just sort of a morale thing. You almost never assigned the airplane with your name on it, except by coincidence. They used to have the name of a pilot, and then the enlisted man whose responsibility it was to keep the plane in good shape. So, but the answer to flying the same airplane, you may like to fly a certain airplane. You could ask if it's in the proper position, and it'd be easy to say, sure, you can fly number 205. But if it was a row behind the one that you're supposed to be in for ease of launching aircraft, you had to take what you got.
So where were you when the Korean War broke out?
We left around the 1st of May of 1950 to go on the usual Mediterranean deployment. And while we're anchored off the French Riviera, it still isn't clear in my mind whether we're in Cannes, France, or another one of those Riviera ports. So on the 26th of June, Sunday afternoon, we got the word that the North Koreans had invaded South Korea. And frankly, most of us didn't even know where Korea was. Korea was not involved to any extent during World War II. It was far enough north so that our Navy had almost no concern about it because the concentration of our operations were in the South Pacific. And so it took us completely by surprise that there was a war had just started out in the Far East. And we had very, very little communications aboard ship in those days. The only contact we had with the outside on a regular basis was there were several news organizations like the United Press, Associated Press, and a couple of others were constantly sending out news items on the radio, and those were the days when radio was the Morse code, da 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 dot dot, and the radioman would copy all this stuff and then reproduce them and circulate them around the ship. The news was very scarce and not in any depth at all. Or when we were ashore, we could go ashore and if we could find French English language newspapers, we could pick up newspapers. So we were at anchor in the Mediterranean, but we continued to operate after that fairly normally. From what we knew, we didn't know that our schedule was being changed at all. But we're also rather curious about how the war was going over in Eastern Asia. And then on the 8th of August, we were anchored in Beirut, Lebanon, which is right at the extreme eastern end of the Mediterranean, where we got word that we were going to go to Korea. And so the first word we got, most of us, junior officers anyhow, is when we heard the clatter of helicopters early one morning landing on the ship. And we went up and saw that the admiral and his staff were being transferred to another carrier that just appeared overnight. And the admiral moved over to that other carrier, plus some other things, equipment on the ship, which were would go with the admiral or go with the ship that was performing his particular mission there. And we came right back to the States. The Suez Canal had not been dredged to the point they could have a ship that size go through the Suez Canal. So we came back to the States, arrived there around the 18th of August. Instead of coming back to Quonset, we went to Naval Shipyard down in Portsmouth, Virginia, right close to Norfolk. Spent 10 days there, and then went down through the Panama Canal, and then up to San Diego, then out to Hawaii. We spent about 2 days in San Diego, 2 days in Hawaii, and then right out to Japan. We spent about a day or two in Japan, and then around up to the Sea of Japan and started operating on the 8th of October off the east coast of Korea. And by time we got there, it was 3 weeks after the very well-known Incheon invasion, where we made an amphibious landing and were able to get around and cut off the North Koreans from the rear. The North Koreans who had bottled up all of our forces down at the Pusan perimeter, which is the extreme southern end of Korea. And we were in great danger of being completely cut off. And if the North Koreans had been successful in defeating the South Koreans and the Americans and some of the other United Nations forces at that time, we would have lost that whole peninsula. But as a result of that invasion in China, it breathed complete new life into the United Nations forces. We started back up north again towards the 38th parallel.
So what were some of your first missions?
Well, we were given about 3 different basic types of missions. One of them, which is probably most common, was we were given targets to destroy. Be such things as power plants, factories, destroyed a lot of railroad tracks because they had a lot of trains running up and down all throughout the Korean Peninsula. We'd have reports of enemy troop concentrations, railroad marshalling yards, anything that had any military significance at all. And we would sometimes be given specific targets before we left the ship, but other times we'd report into what they call a control ship, which was usually anchored in a harbor, and they had more up-to-date information on where air power was needed, so we'd be given assignments at that time. And then have to figure out how to get there with the rudimentary charts we had in the airplane. And we'd find these targets, or sometimes hit targets of opportunity. We carried bombs, we carried napalm, we carried rockets, and we had 50 caliber guns on board. Another type of mission we'd fly is what they called armed reconnaissance, where before we left the ship, we were given a geographical area that we were to patrol almost at will, and we would hit anything that we saw that looked as if it had any military use at all. But we're on our own. If we saw a target, we'd make our own determination as to whether it was worth attacking or not. And then the third type of mission was what called close air support. And this is where we would fly to an area where we had our troops were operating, report into what they call either a ground controller who was on the ground, right with the troops, our own troops, or to an air controller. An air controller was usually a very small airplane flying over the area, could see where enemy troops were, and when we called into either the ground or air controllers, they'd identify themselves, they would tell us where they were, they'd find out from us what kind of ordnance we had on board, and then they would point out where they wanted us to strike. And they say, use rockets on those guys as long as you have them. But those guys, they're down the road, they're about 2 miles down the road, and they're to the right, they're hiding under a bunch of trees or whatever it is. And so we'd fly over our own troops, very low over them, and attack the enemy with whatever ordnance we had. So basically that was it. Bombing missions, either pre-designated or designated later on, armed reconnaissance and close air support.
Now, the incident for which you won the Medal of Honor, that day, what kind of mission were you on?
It was called Armed Reconnaissance.
Oh.
The ship probably for that particular flight launched maybe about 16 airplanes. I don't remember just how many there were, but there's 6 of us from our squadron. And incidentally, you'd have as many as 85 airplanes on the ship. And a big launch would be maybe about 35 or 40 airplanes. And there would be the fighter and attack airplanes along with support airplanes, radar planes, and early warning, and a lot of other types of functions. But on this date, there's 6 aircraft from our squadron. 4 of us flew in a loose formation together, and then the other 2 were probably about a mile away. And we were looking for any enemy activity. Where we were was very far up in North Korea, so that anything was fair game. The only thing that we really tried to be very careful of is not attacking civilians or anything that really didn't have any military use at all. We tried to be very careful on that. We'd rather miss some soldiers than to hit civilians. But the area we're in was very mountainous. The mountaintops came up to as high as 7,000 feet. And it was in the vicinity of the Chosin Reservoir, down which, and this was on the 4th of December, and it was about the 28th of November that our forces, which is the 1st Marine Division and a group of Army troops totaling about 15,000, had been attacked almost by surprise the night of the 28th or the 29th of November by about 120, estimated to 150,000 Chinese troops in the middle of the night. And so our forces were trying to get away from that. They conducted what they refused to say is a retreat, but a withdrawal. And it was just very narrow, a single narrow mountain road on both sides of the mountains that they were fighting in. The road was probably only about 10 or 12 feet wide, barely wide enough for one vehicle to go in one direction. And the Chinese were, attacking, especially during the night, because during the day, if we had aircraft out, the Chinese were afraid of the air power that we had. And on this particular day, we were not close to our own troops, but we were out in the area looking to see if possibly there are other troops anywhere around. And one of the fellows in our squadron, I was what they call flying wing on him. He was not my flight leader, but my section leader. And he suddenly called over the radio that he was losing power and he was going to have to land because he couldn't stay airborne. And the whole area around there was covered with trees, this scrub pine type of thing. And it's not a good idea to land in trees. But he happened to see an area which may have been half a mile in diameter. It was a clear spot near the top of one of the mountains. And so he headed over towards that, and I was talking to him on the radio, helping what to call a checkoff list. Might say it was a crash landing checkoff list, and this is make sure that his shoulder harness was locked. His wheels were up anyhow. His flaps when he got close enough so he knew that he's going to be able to reach the spot, then lower his flaps, which would allow him to slow down a little bit more, drop his tail hook, and then ride the airplane in as best as he could. And if he was all right after the landing, to shut off his battery and get out of the airplane as fast as he could.
Can you tell me what you knew about this man before?
Oh, well,
this incident?
His name was Jesse Brown. He's the Navy's first black pilot. And I joined the squadron in, I think it was November of 1949. Jesse was already in the squadron. He'd been there for about a year. And we flew quite a bit together. He was an ensign. I was fairly newly minted lieutenant junior grade. And we were squadron mates. He wasn't one of my close friends. He had other friends. He was married. I was there. I was not married. And a lot of the married fellows sort of stuck to themselves, and unmarried stuck with themselves, mostly because when we were ashore, the married guys would all go home and we'd go over to the officers' club. It's about the only social recreation we had. And also we had several Naval Academy officers in the squadron, and we didn't stick close together, but we tendency that way because we had sort of different interests from those fellows who only Navy experience they had was from the time they entered flight training. And I didn't know very much about Jesse, but I did learn later on the very, very difficult life that he led as soon as he got into the Navy. We knew that he had one child. They lived I think they lived in Warwick, Rhode Island, which is probably about 10 miles from Quonset Point. So a lot of people asked, did I know him? Yeah, I knew him. But it's like the people you work with on the battleship. You know all those people, but some of them you're probably not even sure where they live and what they do, what their interests are. But you enjoy working with them most of the time. And that was pretty much the relationship we had there in the squadron. Because everybody knew Jesse. Seems corny to say it, but he stuck out like a sore thumb. He was the only other black people we had on the ship were enlisted personnel. Navy had very few black officers at that time. They're swinging in that direction. We're getting more and more as time went on. But Jesse was the first naval aviator.
So you witnessed his crash landing?
Yes. He really crashed hard. There was snow up there. Snow was about 1.5 feet deep. It drifted quite a bit because there was a lot of wind up there. And one of the things that I made sure of was that the canopy of his airplane was open so that he wouldn't be trapped inside without being able to get his canopy open. Well, when he hit the ground, he hit it with such force that the fuselage actually bent at the cockpit. It was bent about 30 degrees to the right at the cockpit, which is probably the weakest part of the whole fuselage. And the force of his landing caused the canopy to slam shut. So because of the condition of the airplane and the speed at which he has to hit the ground, and with the canopy shut by this time, those of us flying overhead just took it for granted that he perished in the crash. And as soon as he did crash, our flight leader climbed to a higher altitude to improve radio communications, and he called the Marines for help to get a helicopter up there. And the rest of us just flew around the aircraft about 1,000 feet above the ground, and commenting back and forth a little bit about, Jesus, oh, poor Jesse. And I don't remember much of the substance of what we were saying. But then the flight leader came back and said, got an acknowledgement, a helicopter is on the way. Well, looking down at the airplane, we could see that the engine had been torn off, but there's smoke coming from the forward part of the airplane, just a little bit of smoke. And he had opened his cockpit, opened the canopy, and waved to us. We said, my God, he's alive. And even though we knew a helicopter was coming up, there was great concern that that smoke would turn into an open fire and possibly catch Jesse, who was, for some reason, we had no idea why, but who was caught in the cockpit. So when I was assured that a helicopter was coming up, but also knowing that it would be a minimum of 20 minutes before he got up there, I decided I'd make a crash landing near his airplane and pull him out of the cockpit while waiting for the helicopter. So that's what I did. With my wheels up and my flaps down, I flew that airplane as slowly as I could, and landed probably about 100 yards away from his. And it was a very hard landing. It was about a 20-degree upslope. And what I had tried to do was get down a little bit below the spot where I was going to land and sort of fly up the hill. But what I didn't realize is that I'd be mushing a little bit. And mushing means that instead of flying that way, you're losing altitude. So at any rate, I landed all right, and then went over to Jesse's airplane, and because of the snow, it was all packed on the soles of my boots, and that made them almost ice-like. I couldn't get traction at all. And on that particular type aircraft, the wings come out from the fuselage at an angle, probably about 20 degrees down angle for about 3 or 4 feet. Then they go out again, up. So there wasn't a level surface on the wing. But I was using both hands. I was able to pull myself up onto the wing and had to hold on with both hands for the most part. And so I was able to get up to the cockpit, and Jesse had his, he'd taken his helmet off, and he apparently tried to unbuckle himself from the parachute and taken his gloves off to do that, and he dropped both of his gloves, and then he couldn't reach them to put them back on. And he was, I'm guessing the temperature was about between 0 and 10 degrees above 0. So when I got to him, his hands were at that time frozen. His hands were useless. And he was very calm and made a comment, something to the effect, Tom, we've got to figure a way to get out of here. I still can't believe how calm he was. The reason I could see the reason that he didn't get out of the airplane was where it had buckled. The edge of the fuselage in the cockpit had jammed his knee against a panel that you'd spread, so he couldn't move it, and very difficult to work because I had to hold on with one hand because I'd fall right off the airplane if I didn't. And there wasn't much I could do with just the other hand. Like, it is as if I could have gotten up and grabbed him under the shoulders and pulled him up out of the airplane. There's no way I could do it. So I ran back to my airplane and the radio was still working, and I called the flight leader and said, tell that helicopter to bring a fire extinguisher and an axe, hoping that he could beat on the side of the fuselage. And obviously the fire extinguisher put that fire out. Then I went back to the airplane and tried throwing snow up into the nose to see if it had any effect on the smoke that was coming out. It had no effect whatsoever. So I talked a little bit with Jesse, but talking was very strained. There wasn't much to talk about. So it was mostly a matter of waiting for that helicopter to come. He came probably about half an hour after I got on the ground. And it was a very small three-place plane. The pilot and two other people. And apparently he had already taken off, and he was recalled when he heard they needed the two of us on the ground by that time. So he had to let his crewmen off, but he did find an axe and a fire extinguisher. So, as I say, about half an hour later, he arrived, and the two of us worked on the airplane. He gave me the fire extinguisher, and it was just a very small called kitty extinguisher, and it was empty after just a few squirts, and it made no difference on that smoke. And I hit probably hit the fuselage with the axe one or two times. It just bounced off. It was absolutely useless. But between the helicopter pilot and me, we worked, but under conditions that we could both of us use only one hand, and we just couldn't do any good. And all this time, Jesse was alternating between consciousness and unconsciousness, and he said almost nothing the whole time. And I realized now, probably did at that time, realize he was in a state of terrific shock. He probably couldn't even feel the condition he was in, both because of shock and because of the cold. And then after about 10 or 15 minutes, the pilot called me aside. It was probably about 3:30 in the afternoon at that time, 3:30, quarter to 4. He pulled me aside. He said, my airplane, I cannot fly my airplane after dark. These mountains would be suicide. I've got to go. We're running out of daylight. He said, you can come with me or stay, but the choice is yours. Well,
I'm just going to change the tape.
Yes. Well, the choice was difficult in one way and simple in another. Difficult because of thinking of leaving Jesse there, but simple in that there's no question about both of us dying. I couldn't possibly have spent more than an hour or so without perishing myself because of the cold. And Jesse was so close to death, we left him. And I think he was unconscious and could well not have regained consciousness when we left him. And he perished in the cockpit. And this fellow, a Marine First Lieutenant named Charlie Ward, happened to be one of 6 pilots, one of 10 pilots of 6 helicopters that we brought over on the Leyte from Norfolk, Virginia, after we got back from the Med and were on the way over to Korea. But Charlie and the other people in the squadron was called Marine Squadron, VMO6. Did a lot of rescue work. They did a lot of reconnaissance work. We spent the better part of let me see, probably the better part of a month going around, a month and a half maybe, going around to China. We used to see those Marines quite a bit. So when he got out of the airplane, I thought, gee, I didn't know his name, but I knew him right away. And of course, he'd seen Jesse a lot in the ship because Jesse stood out so. And he couldn't believe that this fellow that he saw so much of, and I know was talked about a lot, that it was he who was in that tragic circumstance. So at any rate, Charlie took me down to a little base camp at the foot of the Chosen Reservoir called Coterie, which is a camp for the Marines. And all these Marines and a lot of the Army troops coming from up along the reservoir would go through Hagaruri and stay there just long enough to get something to eat, and then continue their way down the mountainside, and eventually to the harbor of Wonsan, where they would be evacuated. But we spent about 10 or 15 minutes at Hagaruri while Charlie went in to get further instructions from his superiors, and we flew to another place 15 miles down to about the only road from the reservoir down to Wonsan Harbor. We spent the night at Coterie in a tent with other Marines. We were surrounded by when I say surrounded, the North Koreans, and particularly Chinese, all over the place. But I spent the night there, and then we flew down to the Yanpo airfield, which was used by the Marines, which were close to Wonsan Harbor, which is still well up in North Korea. And I spent 2 nights down at Yanpo until the weather could clear up enough for a ship to come in from the airplane could come in from the ship to take me back out to the ship. So it was on Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th of 1950, that I got back to the ship after all of this. Then the captain called me to the bridge as soon as I landed and said that he was going to send some aircraft, send a helicopter up to that spot with a flight surgeon to recover Jesse's body and bring him back to the ship. But I dissuaded him of that because the terrain was so terrible. The fact that Jesse had died, the symbology, the whole thing wasn't worth risking the life of a flight surgeon who was going to go up in the helicopter to get his body out. So he fell back on his alternate plan, and that was to send some airplanes up with napalm to destroy the airplane and give Jesse a Valkyrian type of burial. And that's what they did. They destroyed both my airplane and his. And questions been asked, since you're able to fairly well pinpoint where that crash was, why didn't they get the body out? Well, it was so far up north, it's well up into North Korea. The North Koreans won't let anybody up into that area. And some satellite photography some years ago wasn't able to identify where those airplanes were, so we don't know what happened. So that was the end of that whole episode. We finished up it was on the 24th of December, that all of the troops who were up north had assembled at the harbor of Wonsan, in Hungnam was the name of the seaport. And over about a 2.5-week period, they evacuated about 100,000 troops, took them to either Japan or Busan. And what a lot of people don't realize is over 90,000 North Koreans who were fleeing from the Chinese and the North Korean soldiers because they've been living under terrible conditions. So instead of staying in their homeland, they came down south and then were, as I say, evacuated. And it was on Christmas Eve of 1950 that the Navy had completed an evacuation of almost 200,000 people, troops and civilians. So we went back into port about that time, spent several days there, and then went out and operated again for a completely different war now. And then on the 20th of January, we got orders to go back home. See, we, an Atlantic Fleet carrier, were out there in the Pacific because we had disarmed so quickly after World War II that we didn't have the troops, we didn't have the equipment. It's not only aircraft, but the mechanized equipment like tanks and trucks and everything. We were caught completely by surprise. And when they realized the war was going to be as bad as it was turning out to be, the Navy got desperate. I think there were only 2 carriers available in the whole Pacific Fleet at the time, maybe 3. So they needed more aircraft carriers. So that's why we were designated, because by this time we'd spent about 3 months in the Mediterranean doing a lot of flying and training, so that we were in better shape than anybody to go to Korea at this time. So when they got a couple of other aircraft carriers back into commission that could go out there to Korea, we were released to come back to the Mediterranean. Although our ship didn't go back out to the Mediterranean, we came into Quonset, and then we moved from Quonset down to Sanford, Florida, which is about 90 miles south of Jacksonville.
I just want to ask you a couple questions before we go any further. I just want to ask you, what were you thinking when you crashed your plane into the mountain, on the side of the mountain?
Well,
what were you thinking?
I thought, first of all, there was a good chance of saving Jesse's life, because he did wave, he was alive, and I took about everything into consideration that I could think of, and I felt the chances of my being successful outweighed the chances of getting into trouble. And there was an esprit de corps among the people there that if anybody's ever in trouble, everybody do the best they could to help them out. Matter of fact, going back to the Charlie Ward, the helicopter and his squadron, those guys exposed themselves to all sorts of dangers every day. What they were doing, low flying, slow flying. If somebody's in trouble, they'd come. And we did things, either flew lower than we should have, or slower, or places we normally shouldn't. But we knew that if something had happened, one of those guys was going to just bust his back to get out and help us out. So I thought, well, I'll just get in there, pull Jesse out of the cockpit, and we'll wait for the helicopter to come, and everything will be fine. And it didn't happen that way.
And how long did you wait with him before you left?
Well, it was maybe about 45 minutes that before Charlie Ward came. And then after Charlie surveyed the situation and could see that there wasn't anything that he could do that I didn't do, and because dusk was falling, then we got out of there. So it was probably not more than about 20 minutes, half an hour at the very most, that Charlie was with us before we left him.
And when did you find out that you were going to be getting the Medal of Honor? And did you think you might get in trouble for any of it?
No, I could have. I know, but I didn't really give much of a damn whether I got into trouble or not. I don't think there was a moment that I felt about the negatives of this situation. And when the ship got back home, we went into San Francisco. And all the air group were then flown from San Francisco to back to Quonset. And the ship went down through the Panama Canal and then came back to Quonset and maybe up to the shipyard, Boston Naval Shipyard. And so we got home early part of February, and we started our routine that we'd had before. We'd operate out of our squadron area of Quonset Point, and then I got the word latter part of March. I can't remember just exactly how I got it, but I know I got a letter, but I think I may have gotten a phone call from somebody down in Washington to say that I was going to be awarded the medal. And so I was invited to bring my family down. My mother's family is from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and they've always been very close. Lancaster's about an hour and a half drive away. They wanted to be there, so I called to see if I could have 4 more people come. And they sort of reluctantly said okay. Then I had other friends around the area. Well, it ended up, although they wanted to keep it down just to family, there were about 10 or 12 people that were friends of ours wanted to go. So I called this lieutenant commander, and he was in public relations. He sounded as if, we're limited in the number of people we can have. And I told this to a Navy lieutenant who was in public relations also. He heard about this attitude, and he told me later on, and I have no reason to believe he didn't. He called up this lieutenant commander and really waded into him. He said, my God, this was going to be the first medal that was awarded during Korea. He said, you're being so chintzy as to say that this guy's family and his friends can't be with him. Just gave him hell. This guy called back later. He said, okay, we've changed. Instead of being in the blue room or whatever it is, we'll have it out in the Rose Garden. So we had quite a group of people there. My whole family, my mother's family from Lancaster, some friends of mine lived in the Washington area, and it was.
Don't laugh into that.
It was.
I have to go. I need her to move the car.
Oh, all right.
Yes.
Well, they were all there. I don't remember total numbers who were in that party because they had other people. They had the president's naval aide, and Jesse's widow, Daisy, was there. And she was there with 2 escorts. There was a black woman enlisted person, and there was a Navy lieutenant who was named Dennis Nelson, who was one of the Navy's very first black officers. He's one of 13, I think, who was chosen to be commissioned during World War II. And The ceremony was held in the Rose Garden, just outside the White House. There must have been 100 people, 100 reporters there. The place was just loaded with them. And although, as I said, mine was the first presentation after World War II, and yet most of the reporters were out there, not because I was there, but this is Friday the 13th of April, which is the first public appearance the president made after he announced that he had fired General MacArthur. So they were all out there to see him. And it was a beautiful day, April 13th. I hope this April 13th, after all the weather we've had, would be somewhat similar. But it was a very nice ceremony. And anyhow, that was it. The Navy paid the way for our family to go down there, and they put us up in a hotel, and it was just a very enjoyable experience. Thing is that Daisy Brown, who is a nice person, was there, and you think that this was only 4 months after her husband had been killed. And it must have been a very sad occasion for her, because there was great, almost celebration, because I was getting the medal and she was there in the middle of it, and it was because of her husband's death. But she had one child. Her name was Pamela, and she now still lives in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and was a school teacher. She remarried a retired Air Force Chief Master Sergeant who himself died some years later. They didn't have any children, so she has just one child and 2 grandchildren. And both the grandchildren are doing extremely well. She remained actively teaching until about 4 or 5 years ago, I think. And she was asked to stay on the school committee in Hattiesburg. And I don't know just what she does now, but I was asking a friend of mine who has kept pretty close to her, and said she travels quite a bit and is living a reasonably happy life down there in Hattiesburg. So that is it.
So you said that you were sent then to the Mediterranean from Korea?
No. When we got back to Quonset, we had one of the first news that we were received with is they were going to move us from Quonset down to Sanford, Florida. That was a very, very political thing. Truman had appointed an assistant secretary of the Navy who was from that area, and he wanted to open up this Naval Air Station, which had been used during World War II as an operational training squadron, and none of us felt it was the place to go. However, there had been a lot of pressure to enlarge Quonset. Quonset Point, a lot of it is a landfill, and with the days of jets, they needed longer runways and stuff like that. So I don't know what the critical factors were that they considered when they decided to move us down to Sanford, Florida. But we went down there, and we were supposed to get jets shortly after we got there. And because we were going to be transitioning into jets when the air group is comprised of about 4 squadrons, when they were going to go out on the Leyte again for the next year to go to the Mediterranean, because we were in a transitional stage, we didn't go there. We were going to go the next year. Well, in the meantime, I got orders to go to the training command, so I ended up in Corpus Christi. I was an instrument flight instructor for a year. But so I never went back out to the Med again. As a matter of fact, thinking of it now, I don't think the other pilots in our squadron went out because they were by the time they got jets and would have deployed again, they'd been transferred also. Because a tour in the squadron would be only about 3 years. So that by that time, 3 years had passed, and almost nobody from the squadron was out in Korea. Made another Mediterranean deployment with that squadron during that same period.
What I read that you completed jet transition. What exactly is that?
Oh, it's just learning how to fly a jet after you've been flying props. There are enough differences in how to fly, and it's only, I think, it took only about a month or a month and a half. From VF-32, as I said, I went to the training command for a year to be an instructor, and then after being there for only a year, I went out to be an aide to an admiral out on a staff which is based aboard ship, and the ship was based in San Diego. And this ship at the time I joined her was out in the Pacific, in Japan someplace. And so I spent almost 2.5 years with that staff in a carrier. Most of the time we were out in the Japan area, but we came back to San Diego and spent about 4 or 5 months back there. And then when I was out in Japan, I got orders to a jet transitional training unit, which was outside of Kansas City in Olathe, Kansas, and spent probably a month there just learning how to fly jets. And then from there went to what they call a development squadron in Atlantic City for about a year and a half. And we flew all in the Navy's new airplanes, as closely approximating the conditions we'd run into if we were aboard ship. So we spent a lot of time on board ship, but basically we were right in Atlantic City. Actually, we were about 10 miles out, a place called Pomona. But there's a naval air station there, which is still there. It's a big FAA base. FAA is the Federal Aeronautic Administration. It's used to test a lot of flying techniques and equipment and stuff like that. So then after that VX-3 in Atlantic City, I got orders to an Air Force squadron, which is at Otis Air Force Base down near Falmouth on the Cape. And from there went down to Washington to be an aide to an admiral for another 2.5 years. And then from there went to Air War College. And Air War College went into an advanced jet training squadron prior to going into another carrier-based squadron based out of San Diego. And then my eyes went bad on me, so I had trouble landing the aircraft at night aboard ship. So I got orders to the staff in San Diego, spent a year there, and then went out to the carrier Kitty Hawk and spent just almost exactly 2 years aboard Kitty Hawk, and then came back to Washington to be with the Joint Chiefs of Staff for 3.5 years. And then spent about a year down in the Pentagon with a training office under the Chief of Naval Operations, and then it ceased to be fun, so then I retired.
So on the Kitty Hawk, did you go to Vietnam?
Did twice. I reported aboard Kitty Hawk when we were operating off the coast. That was about 2 or 3 months, and we came home for about 6 months, and we went out again. We came home and went out again, and while I was out there, which was the second deployment, I got orders to come back to the Pentagon.
And when did you marry?
Well, I met Georgia while I was in San Diego, based aboard the ship, and after I got orders from the ship to come back home, we agreed to get married in a couple of months. And so I came back to Washington and bought a house, and we got married on I think it was the 1st of August of 1968 in San Diego at the Naval Air Station. She was living there. She'd been married before, and her first husband was killed down in Jacksonville. And I'd never known him or her. And there was a very good friend of mine I went through War College with, who also got orders to Pensacola, to San Diego the same time I did. And he introduced me to Georgia. He'd been widowed at that time, probably about 6 or 8 months. And so we dated off and on for almost 2 years. Then when I got orders to Washington, she agreed to get married, and so I brought her and her 3 children back, and we had our own child a couple of years later. So 2 of them are living in this area, and 2 of them are out in California, and she's from California.
So my last question is a good question. What character traits were you taught as a child that you think that children should be instilled with today?
Respect, first of all, for your family. And this is a two-way street. The parents have to teach the children respect, both by example and by teaching them what respect is. And truthfulness, looking to other people as being people like yourself and treat them the way you'd want yourself taught. And to be honest, there'll be fibbing and even lying at times, and this is almost one of the process of growing up. You're going to be caught in situations you'll lie and fib, but you should be taught not to do that. But a parent has to realize that there are times when a child would, but he and she should both teach them not to lie or fib, because the little fibs grow into big lies, and big lies lead into what our country went through for the last 8 years. And I think love and respect for your fellow man, truthfulness and honesty, and patriotism comes along with that. I'm stressing patriotism all the time, but that's with the assumption that you have the other traits of honor that are so important to make good citizens, which are so important to make a good country. So,
Was there anything else you'd like to add?
No. I'm glad you didn't ask some questions, but well, there'll be the questions asked, how do you feel your life has been changed having the Medal of Honor? Well, obviously it has changed. But I think that most of us who have the medal feel very strongly that we were lucky. Some fellows found themselves in situations where they had to sort of fight themselves out of it, and they're recognized because of the way they did fight. Other people go out and look for it and perform actions that weren't at all. But there's no way of putting a number on it, but I'm willing to say that probably 5 times as many people are deserving the medal as were recognized. In battle, people do things that most civilians can't even understand. That if all the details have been known, and if there were witnesses to see this, and these recommendations were written up in some way, there'd be quite a few people who have earned the medal. We know there are people who performed in such a way that they were more entitled to it than a lot of us who are lucky enough to be recognized. But the medal is a very prestigious one, and it's probably the most prestigious in any nation. That's just a matter of opinion, but we feel that we really have a responsibility to represent all the people who've been in the military, and that we're lucky, and that in some way we were designated to represent the best of people in the military, and that's the way I've tried to live my life. I can't imagine anything would be more embarrassing for a guy to brag about everything he did, and then come to find out the guy he's bragging to had it all over him for what he did in the military. And just because a lot of us did things which were recognized doesn't mean at all that there weren't a hell of a lot of people who conducted themselves just as well, if not better, than we who happen to be recognized acted when we were in service. And I think, not from the selfish point of view, but I think there should be quite a bit of emphasis put on the Medal of Honor and the society that we're all part of. Emphasis not on what we did individually, but what the military is all about. And what really gets their attention is when the military is talked about in, you might say, in terms of individual valor, and too many civilians don't have the faintest idea what it's all about. But I really do feel, with all its faults, and they still have the faults, and they've had terrible faults in the past, the military can still be looked to as the institution which really forms the strength of our whole society. And it's one of the things I was so upset about our last commander-in-chief, is that not only did he not support him, but he almost seemed to go out of his way at times to demean the military. And he was, he among other things, he was a hypocrite, and was very bad for the country. And it's just a very discouraging thing to, even now, after seeing what he did around the time of his turning over the reins to George Bush, that the American people wouldn't all have recognized that he was not worthy of that job, and that it was not only a disservice to our country for what he did to them, but it's had pretty bad impact on the rest of the world too. Very few people respected him. They had to put up with it when he was president. I'm hoping now that George Bush will be strong enough to correct a lot of the wrong things that Clinton did. Wrong things being things he did do, and things that he failed to do that he should have done. So now I'll get off my soapbox with that.
Well, thank you very much.
Sure.
It's been an honor.